Osio, Maburiga, welcome to the Red Road East. I'm your host, Fierce Truth Seeker. The Red Road East is an Indigenous TV program dedicated to archiving and preserving the history, legacy, and culture of the original peoples of the Americas east of the Mississippi River and the Caribbean. Yeah, I know that it's been a while since I've done a show, and I apologize deeply for that. And the reason why I've been gone for a while is my crazy work schedule, um, and life's challenges and things of that nature. So I do apologize for the long wait. But as long as the wait has been, it's well worth the wait because this evening I have a guest who is no stranger to the Red Road East show. However, this particular guest has come reloaded with information that is a lot more in depth than the last time our guest was here. And our guest has found a lot of profound information with regards to identity and how we fit into the scheme of things in terms of ethnicity, nationality, and how the DNA plays into that. Okay. And so, right about now, without further ado, I am going to bring on Dr. Fatou Diarra. All right. Dr. Fatou, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
It's a pleasure. It's a
Likewise.
real pleasure. Yeah. And I know that you've been on the grind with your research. And I know that with my viewers, your topic is very controversial. Um, and a lot of the points in your title is considered taboo to a lot of my audience.
Hmm.
So they'll either be turned off by the title and say, oh, F that,
Hmm.
or they may want to come and challenge you. And as I said when I posted this up on Facebook, anyone who feels that they know a little something about DNA is welcome to watch the show. And at the end of the show, we will entertain questions and answers. All you have to do is leave your link, leave your email in the chat, and I'll send you a link where you can join the panel and you can ask your questions to the doctor. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get into the presentation. And I see before we start, I see we have someone who has joined in already. Okay, and we have here. Let's see. This is uh, Haitian. Let me see. I'm trying to see the name. It's so small for my eyes. Okay, Haitian Revolution Fake. All right, Islam, Islam. How's it going? Yeah. All right. So, Doc, I'll bring up the slides, and you just tell me. how I should, proceed with those slides. Let me first open up the shared screen here. And so before we start, I'll put the disclaimer out there that the views and opinions of our guests and guests plural is not necessarily the views and opinions of the host or the television show. And with that said, I will pull up this slide presentation here. And so we have here um, a lengthy amount of slides. Okay, very lengthy. And the title of the today lecture is "What Became of the Moors of Europe? Moorish Genetic Patterns in DNA Test Results of both the quote unquote Black American and Caribbean populations." Okay. Now, I know we have a lot of people who have a lot of opinions about DNA. And I always tell people, that you have to use all of the tools in your arsenal. Me personally, I use all of the tools in my particular arsenal when it comes to, you know, my um, my genealogy and stuff like that. I use everything, and it helps you to take. Like I grew up knowing my genealogy, so once I did the DNA and you know it allowed me to meet more relatives you know that I never knew existed, and you make a lot of good connections. But anyway, um let me not delay because it's a lengthy lecture. And Dr. Fatu, the floor is yours.
Okay. So today's focus is on the Moorish genetic patterns in DNA tests of both so-called African Americans, also known as Black Americans, and the Caribbean populations. What became of the Moors of Europe? Now, before I get started, let me say this. This is about studying the genetic patterns of these two groups of people. Okay. I'm not pushing any sort of identity politics. All I'm doing is describing genetic patterns which reflects our history, genetic patterns which reflects pre-Columbian history to modern day history, and how to recognize it if you are a participant in the genetic studies. So if anybody's followed me and have listened to my lectures elsewhere, I talked about the DNA patterns, which actually proves that we are indigenous to the Americas. Okay. But that's not the only DNA that we have, because we had invaders here, some of them friendly, some of them not so friendly. Okay. And these DNA patterns also show up in our DNA. So I'm not saying that we are the Moors. What I am saying is that the transatlantic slave trade, which has been pushed as our genesis, was not how it happened. Number one, our genesis was in the Americas. Let me first state that we are indigenous to the Americas. Now, what happened is that the transatlantic slave trade is pushed as the source of the African DNA. And what I have discovered by studying the DNA patterns is that what the DNA pattern shows is that a good portion of that African DNA that came in fact, was Moorish, European. And that's what I'm going to show. So if anyone thinks that this presentation is to somehow or another impose a Moorish identity onto the people here, No, that's not what this is about. This particular lecture is to demonstrate how to recognize the components that make up our DNA, which points to origins that actually show that we derived from the Moors of Europe in terms of who came in on the indigenous people here. Now, there's a lot to discuss, but anyone who's heard my prior lectures, I talked about the genetic patterns that are consistent with showing our indigenous lineage here. And I talked about the similarity to the Bantu population of Africa. And I know Bantu is not considered a political correct term, but let's just use it, meaning the southern area of Africa. We are not from there, but we are genetically more similar to those individuals stretching from southern Nigeria across to Kenya, going down to the southern parts of Africa, which incorporate Madagascar, South Africa, Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, all of those areas, Angola, Congo. Okay, we are more close in genetic similarity. And I also talked about in prior lectures that that region is not exclusive to Africa. That's the trick that they have played. But we have to get over this emotional reaction to that word in order to catch the truth of the genetic studies. Because once we hear that word Africa, many of our people jump up and we just want to throw it away. And what I'm saying is, if you understand that that is a play on words and that this so-called quote unquote African DNA that is Bantu-like was in fact global, and it is all over the planet. It is in Polynesians, the people out of Tahiti, Samoa. The Polynesians have 20 to 25% of that same Bantu DNA. It's found in Tibet. It's found among the Navajo natives. Some of it is referred to as the Mozambican gene. DNA consultants referred to a portion of it as Mozambican gene. If you catch my point, I want people to understand that that is global. So whether we're digging up ancient skeletons in Europe like Otzi, whether we're talking about the Polynesians, or whether we're talking about indigenous Americans, whether we're even talking about the West Africans are not the oldest people on that continent. The older part of them is Bantu. So I don't want to get sidetracked on that. If anybody is interested, I did lectures explaining that. But now there's another component. When we see the West African part of our DNA, the typical mindset is to attribute that to the transatlantic slave trade. As we move on, I'm going to show the audience that that West African DNA, whether it's Ghanaian, Senegambian, Malian, etc., is really Moorish DNA. Okay, so now that I gave that introduction and I explained what my agenda is with this lecture, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so let me talk about some key points that I would like to address. Who were the Moors? What was their description or images? What were the genetic groups that compromised the Moors? The genetic evidence of the Moors, DNA in Europe from ancient times, the genetic composition of various Moorish groups, genetic evidence of Moorish DNA patterns in non-African populations, the relationship between the Moors and West Africans, and the historical events that spread DNA to one region to the other, influencing what we now what I now call Moorish DNA, all right? And Nigerian DNA, which is often exemplified by Yoruba DNA and their global presence, okay? Next slide. Other points, the transfer of the Moors to the colonies and to the Caribbean, and genetic proof of the transfer of Moors from Europe, and the merging of the Moors with the indigenous populations and how that shows up on DNA studies now. This is what I'm covering. Next slide. Okay, so there's different definitions of Moors. When it comes to Moor, you hear different things. So I'm just going over a few definitions. Okay, Moor comes from the Greek word moros, meaning black, or Latin meaning moro. The Latin word for black was not moro, but it also can mean very dark. You know, so these are just various definitions. Moor doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. Okay, next slide. Okay, but in its strictest definition, Moor really pertains to the people of North Africa, the Amazigh people, also known as Berbers. Berber is considered a pejorative term for them because that means barbarian, and they prefer to be called Amazigh people. These are the people from Morocco going across even to Egypt, Libya, Algeria, parts of Mali and Niger. Okay, you can move to the next slide. And this is pretty much another definition, but it expands on what I just said. A member of Northwest African Muslim people of mixed Berber and Arab descent. Sometimes they mean a mixture of the Amazigh and the Arabs. We can move to the next slide. And variations of the Moors, that term has been used by many Europeans since ancient times as a general description for the dark-skinned indigenous people as well as Africans. So you can see sometimes when you read literature that it is used interchangeably with African as well. So I'm just showing the various definitions and how it has been used. We can move to the next slide. Okay, so you will see various sculptures historically of Moors. And if you just look at the paintings and the sculptures, you will see that when you look at the various phenotypes on the African continent, you will see that many of these images resemble West Africans in terms of phenotype. These people don't look like the people from the southern portions of Africa, like Angola or Zambia or South Africa. They don't look like Horn Africans, and they don't look like Amazigh people in terms of how we view Amazigh people in a modern sense. But we're going to revisit that, okay? Because there's the mulatto type of Amazigh that's constantly pushed to the forefront, and they're not all mulattoes, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Next slide. So again, I'm just showing different paintings. Europeans painted, you had European painters that painted the population that was also living there in Europe. Europe had a sizable population. It wasn't as white as it is now. There was a cleansing out period. So it is also not coincidental that when you look at some of these faces, we have seen some of these faces even amongst our people, okay? So you can move to the next slide. Again, different phenotypes. Next slide. Okay. This is okay, I want to take a look at that with that brooch. You with the two faces, that one. Okay. Uh, as you can see, that's also a Moor. And I want to take a look at that because if you look at the profile and the hairline of that man, you will see that same hairline in the Benin Togo lower region of Nigeria, Ghana. Okay. I want your audience to pay attention to that because we're going to revisit that. Okay. All righty. Move to the next slide. This is a painting of two Moors by Rembrandt. And when you do the reading on it, they will talk about how you had uh, blacks, Moors living in Amsterdam. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. These painters painted individuals that they actually saw. Next slide. Okay, that's pretty much the same thing, the same painter, Rembrandt. You can move to the next slide. That's an explanation of the painting. You can move. We can move. Okay, this is also another type of Moor. This would be the Muslim Moors from North Africa. So you can see there's a slight different phenotype, a longer face. You can move to the next slide. Okay, different phenotypes that we see in Northwest Africa, in the Senegambian region, Malian area, longer faces, sharper features. Move to the next slide. Again. Okay, next. Okay, so, I'm basically showing pictures. This is, paintings from the Iberian Peninsula, and again represents the Moorish, the Moors who were in the Iberian Peninsula. So, you have the Moors that were in Northwest Europe, and then you have the Moors that were in the Iberian Peninsula, and they have different phenotypes. If you look back at the phenotypes of the gentlemen that were painted by Rembrandt, they looked a little bit different than these gentlemen that are being shown in Spain, even though they're all of the African family. Okay. Next slide. Another Northwest African. And I'm very sure some of you recognize some of these faces among us, because even when people come in and mix, the genes don't go anywhere because we kept mixing among ourselves. And so sometimes these phenotypes will pop up. Okay, next slide. And, I threw this in because this was, I'm sure some of you are familiar when, before Harry got married and he invited Meghan over, this is what Harry's cousin wore at the dinner. And, they said this was an insult, but it wasn't an insult. She was just acknowledging the history.
Exactly.
So she had a Moorish pin on. You can go to the next slide.
She says, I will not take it off. That is a blackamoor.
And that's a close-up of it. And you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So the Moors have had a huge presence in Europe. In Southern Europe, it wasn't a, put it this way, a friendly type of existence, because you had wars going on between Christians and Muslims, and you still have festivities going on in Spain that commemorate those conflicts, like, for example, between the Moors and Christians of Alcoy, the Cavalcade of Kings. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. Those are actually Spaniards in blackface, but you can see who they're depicting. They're not depicting anybody but someone Black African. And that is actually, you will go to Mali and Niger, Algeria, Tunisia, and that is how they dress traditionally. Many of the tribes, the Amazigh men. You can move to the next slide. All righty. So is that, there's no way you can enlarge that, can you?
Let me see. Let me check here.
And if you can't, I'll you.
Let me try. View
If you
and
don't go
see here.
crazy.
Hold on. No, it's okay. Should allow me to zoom in. Let me see.
I see it right there. You see that zoom menu?
Zoom. Where do you see that?
Right there on your, you opened it
Oh,
up.
zoom menu. Okay. Yeah. All right. Zoom in. There it is. Thank you.
All right.
Let me try.
So,
Let me try to do it again. Make it
okay.
bigger. Let's see. Zoom. Need it bigger than that?
I think that's good.
Okay.
Okay. Because it requires explanation. So, this person is Ghanaian, full Ghanaian. And this is an archaeogenetic site by Map My Genes, where I uploaded his raw data and I mapped it out. And basically, this is a mapping of his raw data, DNA, and it's mapped against ancient bones across the planet. Now, what can't be seen is the map of Africa. So I have to kind of, and Europe, but I have to point it out. Okay. If you look at that orange circle, that's the Mota sample from Ethiopia. So you can see that his greatest closest match genetically is to the Ethiopian highlands to the Mota sample. Okay. And then you would notice some other ancient matching as well in the eastern part of Africa. Okay. Then you will also notice a little bit of lighted areas in the areas above that are lit. That's Europe. Okay. We're talking about Neolithic Europeans. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because West Africans weren't always where they are. As a matter of fact, when you start talking about who are the oldest Africans, West Africans are relatively young in terms of their genetic existence. If you look at the older part of a West African, it goes back to the Bantu people. Now, I said in the very beginning that Bantu type, okay, of DNA was not exclusive to Africa. It was global, it was ancient, and all populations had Bantu, a certain amount of Bantu DNA. And I'm only using that word is in a modern sense because the people that have that genetic similarity are found in the southern parts of Africa, but it's not exclusive to them. Okay, that's the trick. So the older part of the West African goes back to Mota, who was Bantu and found in Ethiopia, where that big orange circle. But you can also see that the West African has ancient matching to ancient Europe, those tiny, small dots. Okay, and we're going to touch upon that as we move on because this starts tying into proof of how it ties into us. So I'm giving the background information. There's no slide here that's a waste. I have to break it down from the very beginning so it makes sense later on. Okay, so move to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is regarding the previous slide. Can you just enlarge that a little bit?
Sure. More.
Um, it's okay. Yeah, you could do it a little more, just so you know.
That's good.
That's fine. Oh, so basically, the chart explains what I just pretty much explained about the map. You can see at the top, his closest match would be to the Mota sample in Ethiopia. So the West Africans, a part of their lineage, a good part of their lineage came from the East. Okay? They were not always there. And when you look at South Africa, that's actually a Khoisan sample. All right? Because Khoisan was also an ancient group of people. The Pygmies and the Khoisan were ancient global people. So
Say it again. Say it again. Say it again.
the Khoisan and the Pygmies were ancient and global. The Pygmies were in Americas, the Khoisan were in the Americas as well.
That's
So
right.
at the root of all people will be Pygmy and Khoisan, and then Bantu. Bantu is older than the West African, and all those populations, those three populations, Bantu, Pygmy, and Khoisan, they were global, not
Right.
the West African. The West African is not global. He's a new kid on the block. Okay, those three. So if you are indigenous to this planet, you have to have those three
Yep.
at your root. So there's no need to become excited when you see that word African. It's a trick because this was global DNA. It is not exclusive to Africa. But if you don't possess it, you're not of this planet. You're not indigenous because that's what makes you indigenous. Anyone who's ancient to this planet has it. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Okay,
Hmm.
next slide.
I agree 1,000%. You have actually confirmed with DNA what my research has yielded. So I'm loving it.
Yeah, the archaeogenetics and the breakdown confirms it. So this is a continuation. So if you look at the very right hand column, you will see that the right hand column gives the genetic distances. You see the 3.6, 3.6, 3.7, and then you see 8. The only purpose of this, okay, because I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, is I want you to see the populations that contributed to this Ghanaian individual. As you can see, there's the Neanderthal, because believe it or not, that's actually a lie that continental Africans don't have Neanderthal markers. They actually do. It's just not as much as non-Africans. Okay. And you can also see he has matches to ancient skeletons from Hungary, Austria, and Anatolia, which is Turkey, modern day Turkey. Okay. This is what comes after the Ethiopian and the Khoisan, the ancient European. So, as we can see, the ancient Ethiopian Khoisan, which was a Bantu, the Khoisan, the Pygmy, and the ancient European is a contributor to the makeup of the West African. That's what I'm showing. Okay, next slide. Okay, hold on. Okay, so this is an individual who is from Montserrat. Okay, and this is the archaeogenetic map. It's a better picture, so I'm able to actually show. This is the same map, my genes archaeogenetic map of an individual from Montserrat. And I picked that individual for a reason, because as we go further in the lecture, I don't know if we'll have time today, but I will explain the people from Montserrat can say for certain, without a shadow of a doubt, that they are descendants of blackamoors that were removed from Ireland during the period of Oliver Cromwell, and they do not have any lineage whatsoever from Africa via any transatlantic slave trade, none whatsoever. I don't care how they look, they come from Ireland, and they were cleaned out of Ireland, and you had some mixing with the original population that was there, but you have some families that are extremely Blackamoor in Montserrat. So this is an archaeogenetic map of this gentleman who is from Montserrat. He was born there. Both of his parents are from there. And you can see he has a similar pattern in terms of his archaeogenetic map to the West African with some minor differences. So you can see he also, his greatest matches to the Bantu area of Ethiopia, Mota man, some ancient sites in Kenya. And you can also see the differences. He has more matching, which is more pronounced in Europe. We're going to go to the next slide and expand on that. So if you look, basically, this is an explanation of what I just said. You can see his first match is to the Mota sample of Ethiopia, then also Khoisan. That's standard if you're on this planet. The Bantu, the Khoisan. Next slide. Now, here's the difference. I want you to look at that far right column. You see that number 4.4, and then you see 4.4, 4.7. Those represent genetic closeness. If you recall, when I showed the Ghanaian man sample, his genetic difference was greater. But with the man from Montserrat, his genetic closeness is closer. So you can see he's closer at 4. The Ghanaian was 8 to the samples out of Europe. So you can see his match is given a rate of 4 to the Hungarian sample. And you can go to the next slide, going down. So he's closer to the European. And these are not modern Europeans, pale Europeans as we know it. Okay? Now, this is a Jamaican, his archaeogenetic map. And I want to point out something. On the left side of that screen, it's hard to really see the continents, but the left side is basically North America, that purple, that's all Canada and California. Then you see the yellow dot, that's in the area of Belize, an ancient sample. And then you see a bunch of dots that's lined up all along the corridor of Peru, Argentina. That's what you're seeing. And I want you to take note of that. Now, let's look at his matches. You will notice that he also, just like the Montserrat sample, this person has a large match to the Mota sample, to the Kenya sample, again representing the ancient Bantu. Then you got the South Africa. But notice the prominence also in Europe. Unlike the Ghanaian, there was some lighting for Europe, but the difference is there was many more generations of separation for the West African in terms of any migration from Europe. You're dealing with more genetic closeness. Now, the fact that we see the map lit up heavily for these Patagonia sites in South America, even Mexico, and even North America, what this demonstrates is this is an individual who's dealing with 2 lineages. Now, let me just first say this. I'm aware that they have not given us all the skeletons there is. I mean, we don't have control over this. So these are primarily Mongol type, Asian derived skeletons. They have not given us the skeletons from the Southeast, and we know that there are skeletons from the Southeast. They have them in the museum from the area of Southampton. I've been told this, okay? But they have not given us that. So let's work with what they have given us, even though there's a bias with what they have given us. And they have given us primarily Asian-derived native skeletons in the Americas. This individual from Jamaica still matches them because there was intermixing between the originals and the people that migrated here. So that ancient mixing was inevitable. But he also has a pattern that is very similar to the Montserrat man. And we're going to deal with that as we move on. Next slide. Okay, so this is an explanation of what I was talking about. So you can see here his closest matches are to Tanzania and Ethiopia. Now, this really touches upon what I talked about in the very beginning, because if you notice, his first match is to the Tanzania area. You start getting more similarity to Southeast Africa, and you will notice these similarities found in the indigenous population in the Americas to Southeast Africa. So oftentimes when people take DNA tests, they will notice that they will have some similarity to Tanzania, Malawi, and this does not reflect direct lineage, but it reflects genetic similarity based on SNAPs, single nucleotide polypeptide, polymorphisms, okay? This is SNAP similarity. And you can see also he matches the people from Ethiopia, the Moda people. Next slide. Okay, so if you look towards the right, this is what I wanted to show. In the right column, you can see the closeness genetically, and look what you have there, Brazil. So, and you can see it's at a closeness of 3. So what does this show? It shows a lot of mixing, ancient mixing with the people from South America. That is relatively close in terms of genetic distance, okay? And I tend to see this, by the way, with many Caribbean people. They tend to have a lot of genetic closeness to the Patagonian sites on archaeogenetics compared to my samples from North America. So-called African Americans are a little further away from the South American sites, the skeleton sites. Next slide. Okay. Now, this is a so-called African American. This is their archaeogenetic map. And you're probably wondering, well, why is Europe more lit? We're going to get into that. As we move further into the studies, one of the things we see evidence of is that the indigenous tribes of North America had an ancient relationship with the population of Europe before the Moors, as we know it, came there. So understand that there were different various of brown, black people that inhabited Europe, just pretty much like what you have going on today. So the West African, North African Moors, right, were not always the main occupants of Europe. You had an ancient brown people that were very similar to the people of the East Coast of the United States. So when you look at people from North America, we tend to have these closer matches to the Guanche people of Northwest Africa, Amazigh people as well, and also the ancient people of Europe who preceded the people we now know as Moors. And of course, we will also have ancient matches to the Mota, because again, that signifies the ancient matching similarity to Bantu people. You see also Kenya, again, Bantu people, and again, simply reflecting our ancient lineage to planet Earth. Okay, next slide. So as I always say, now this is the African American again, so-called African American, and you can see the top matches. What do we have? Tanzania, South Africa, which is Khoisan, Tanzania, which is a Bantu sample, Ethiopia, which is the most ancient Bantu sample that they have, Mota. Again, you're not human, you're not indigenous if you don't have these markers in your DNA. Next. But what do you see as the next closest? If you can move that over, that slide, I want to catch the far right column. Right, move it over. No, the other. Yes, I want you to see those distances, 1.5. Look at the Canary Islands, Guanche. That's the same individual that I showed with those huge circles in Northwest Africa. The reason why those circles were big, because look at that. The genetic difference is 1.6. You see how close that is? Very close. So there's an ancient genetic relationship. See, when you have genetic distances that close, reflecting a lot of genetic similarity, that's not just like one person's ancestor coming in. That's a back and forth type of mixing. And that's what I see with the people who tend to come from the North American tribes, which would be Afro-Americans or people who are in the tribes. Okay, this is what I tend to see. Okay, this actually is my uncle's sample, and I have seen this with people in the tribes as well. You can move to the next slide. Oh, that's a blank slide. Blank slide. Okay. All right. So moving on, let's discuss this, because when we take modern DNA tests, okay, we often get various components like this. And a good portion of our people, we don't know what to do with this. What does this mean? And so I totally understand why people decide to just throw their hands up and throw away DNA, because I mean, truthfully, it was not created for us to understand. It was done to, as far as I'm concerned, it was done to fool us. But thank goodness we have people like Tyrone Lewis Cannon and other people who are not afraid to jump knee deep into this and dive right in it and figure it out, because there is a pattern and there's a reason why we see this. So there's no reason to run away from it. Now, when we take DNA tests as people from the Caribbean to North America, and also South America too, but my focus is on the Caribbean and North America because there's a shared heritage between us, okay? You're going to see, like, for example, various tests, Nigerian DNA. Sometimes they don't specify what they mean by the Nigerian DNA. Different tests will have Yoruba DNA as the signature of what is Nigerian DNA, although there are various ethnicities in Nigeria. Sometimes you might see Isan Yoruba DNA. Sometimes you see Benin Togo. I know that on Ancestry DNA, they now have a category called Nigerian East Central. And you also have Senegambian DNA, which is also similar to the Guinean DNA. Sometimes you might see Mandinka, Gambia, or Guinean. These are all various terms for the same region. Then you have the Ghanaian. Sometimes they lump it with the Sierra Leone, and sometimes you see Ghanaian DNA or Sierra Leone DNA. Sometimes Akans, which is a major subdivision within Ghana. They're a major language group divided in subdivisions, but they're similar genetically to one another. You'll see Mende DNA. Then sometimes you'll see Malian DNA. Ancestry DNA will have Malian DNA as well as Senegambian DNA. You will find that on 23andMe, they don't even use Malian DNA. So anyone who is Malian who will take 23andMe will often get high Senegambian markers. And then you have North African DNA. So these are the components of actually the Moors. All right. This is Moorish DNA. All right, let's move to the next slide. That's a blank. Can you reduce that? That's good. Okay, so this is an anthropological text. It's written in French, and your listener audience, whoever follows me knows I've referenced this. I learned about it from Obashengo L, and it speaks to the intermixing between our people and the Amizigh people from North Africa, who are an ancient people of North Africa. Okay, so there was, if you just look at the map, you can see it goes straight across the Atlantic. You can see North America is right across, and if you go straight across laterally, horizontally, you will hit Northwest Africa, North Africa. So there's evidence that these Amizigh people have intermixed with people from North America. And I have the genetic evidence of that. Okay. So this is an anthropological text. They don't deal with it in terms of DNA, but they deal with it in terms of linguistic evidence. Okay. But what I want to say was this was a back and forth relationship. By no means was it all one way with just these people coming in, intermingling with us. We also went into those areas. And it seems we went into those areas first. All right. Next slide. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a book written by Barry Fell. Barry Fell was a professor of invertebrate zoology, and he was seen as controversial, and he was seen as a pseudo archaeologist. And Barry Fell wrote about Bronze Age Europeans migrating and contributing to the peopling of North America. And it seems Barry Fell was not wrong, because the DNA supports Barry Fell. You can go to the next slide. I also mentioned that it was a back and forth type of relationship. We were going to Europe, and we had Bronze Age Europeans and ancient Europeans also coming over here. And you have Jack Forbes. He also talked about this. And The DNA supports these men. Okay, no need for debates. We have the genetic evidence that supports these men. Jack Forbes, I'm sure your listening audience is quite familiar with him. He was a American historian, writer, and a scholar.
Yeah, they're very familiar. I've covered the book on the show before.
Oh yeah, and he was actually of Lenape and Powhatan lineage himself. Uh,
Hmm.
and you could go to the next slide.
Okay.
Mhm. Okay, and you actually put me on this book. You fierce.
Mm.
David McRitchie talked about um, brown Europeans. David McRitchie was a Scottish folklorist, and he wasn't given the proper respect in his time. But it turns out that he talked about the ancient Australoid presence. He talked about brown Europeans. He talked about the copper colored race being antecedents in Europe. And again, all of this is backed up by DNA. We can go to the next slide. So, what is the genetic evidence? Well, Donald Yates is the founder of a genetic group called DNA Consultants. That's another DNA company. And I've always encouraged anyone who is interested in doing genetic studies to also participate in third-party tests, not just mainstream tests, because that's where you start seeing the truth. So this is an article written by Donald Yates, and he talks about the admixture in Pima Indians, and where you see Greek and Sardinian and genetic signatures of the Minoans and Sea peoples and other Mediterranean peoples in the Southwest. So this starts touching upon what Barry Fell talked about. There was definitely a relationship between the brown people of Europe, the ancient Europeans, and the people in North America. And it shows up in the DNA of many of us, so-called African Americans and people who also belong to the tribes. So the significance of mentioning Sardinia, why is that significant? Because Sardinians are lighter now because of the invasions, but Sardinians actually have one of the older DNA of Europe. They have an ancient DNA marker from Europe. So when you start getting Sardinian on DNA tests, that's a marker of old European. Okay, so many of us will see that we have these matches to Southwest Europe, the Mediterranean, and we don't understand why, but it's not new. And that's what I'm illustrating here. You can go to the next slide. And in that article by Donald Yates, he also talks about smaller contributions within the Pima would be Tunisian. Okay, see, this is going back to what I mentioned, Mozabite, Druze. Druze would be an area of Lebanon. Okay, Bedouin DNA, that's from Southwest Asia, the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so what it's showing is this relationship. Okay, and it's not coincidental that he is finding this in people who are from North America, because as I showed with my uncle's slide, he had those large circles in Europe, that's ancient Europe, and the Guanches of the Canary Islands as well. Okay, so this is all reinforcing the findings here. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So this is an excerpt from David McRitchie's book, Modern Britons. And here, let's read it. In addition to the black or brown and yellow races already spoken of as prehistoric Europeans, there is a theory that a copper-colored race closely akin to some branches of American Indians once inhabited Europe, or rather the southern parts of Europe and North Africa. Proof of this are said to be visible in the complexion of the modern Copts, which is reddish, and of the Nubians, who are described as of deep red color. And I have to tell you, if any of you have been to Aswan and you've been around some of the people that are called Nubians, and I have, and even some of the Amizigh people, you will see that some of them have that copper color and complexion, and have some resemblance to some of the people of the East Coast tribes. Absolutely. Okay. Next slide. So we're going to touch upon Otzi. Okay. Why? Because Otzi, it turns out, is a 5,000-year-old mummy. He was a brown man, and his genetic profile was very similar to East Coast natives, and I'm going to show you. Next slide. That's a picture of Otzi. Next slide. So this is the MDLP. I believe this is the plain MDLP, and using the JED kit that was assigned to Otzi, when you load it up, what do you see as the first population he is closest to? Zoom in on that. Lumbee. You could just slide it. You can see that the first population that Otzi is most similar to would be the Lumbees. And the reason why, and the reason that ties into so-called African Americans, because when you look at a Lumbee's DNA, and I have, and you upload their DNA to, let's say, the MDLP 16, you will see that the population that they're closest to is the African American. So the so-called African American and the Lumbees are very genetically similar. The Lumbees would generally be more mixed with European Sephardic Jews.
Mm-hmm.
They're just more mixed. But in terms of their other component, it is very similar. They are an amalgamated people mixed with Algonquian, Siouan, Iroquoian, a little bit of Muskogean tribes all together. And they're mixed in with many of the early colonists who came in, who were Sephardic and Jews and Moors, and other colonists as well. And this is who Otzi is most similar to. Okay. And by the way, let's look at some of the other components of Otzi, because it speaks to movement between the continents. You can see Puerto Rican, which is based on the population that's there now. ST7 represents old European lineage, and you would see that's very prominent in Sardinians, Moroccans, the Miwok people from California, indigenous people of California, Colville, who are a Native American population. They are Salish-speaking people. You have the Tatars, who are Central Asian people. in the Russian area, Central Asian people. And then you have modern day Mexicans, Costanoans, Mozabites, who come out of the Algerian region, Algeria, North Africa, Tatar, Bashkir, and other Central Asian people. Then you have the Ashkenazim and you have the Tatar, okay? So this is pretty much the top components that make up Otzi. So he was quite miscegenated. But what's key from this slide is that he was very similar to the East Coast natives, okay? And he had some evidence of mixing with indigenous peoples from North America, all right? That's what I'm demonstrating with that slide. Next slide. So you can see this is also another breakdown of Otzi, okay? You can see Otzi is what they call, we're going to talk about that word sub-Saharan coming up soon, all right? He was roughly 17 and change sub-Saharan, Northeast African, Southeast Asian, South Asian, North Sea Atlantic Amerindian, okay, which is based on the Asian population. That's what they define as Amerindian, Siberian, West Asian. You can go to the next slide. So you can see that's his mitochondrial DNA category, and that's his Y DNA, which is not representative of what's dominating these regions now, which is R under the category of R1b, R1a, Eastern Europe, R1b, Western Europe. Mitochondrial DNA is now dominated by H and U. You can go to the next slide. Okay. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Can you go back to the previous slide? Actually, what I wanted to show was that this was my true ancestry. And with my true ancestry, for those of your listening audience who also participate with my true ancestry, you have something called ancient relatives. So basically, these are samples that literally you share this a certain amount of your DNA with. So in truth, you can say that you share ancient lineage with these samples. So these are two different Afro-Americans, and they shared actual ancient DNA ties with Otzi. And that's what I'm showing here as well. You can go to the next slide. Again, another individual showing. This slide doesn't capture it, but what it says is, one is your raw data, your raw DNA is 68% closer than the other matching users. And the other one said your raw DNA is 44% closer than other matching users. So again, we see this with some of the North Americans, all right? So-called African Americans, whether they're in tribes or outside of tribes, we will see this kind of close matching to Otzi, representing an ancient lineage with brown Europe, okay? Next slide. That would have to be reduced. Yes. Okay. Reduce that a little more, actually, because the top needs to be shown. I think there's a slide button. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. That's actually good. That's good. So what I'm showing here with the My True Ancestry Archaeogenetics site, this will be one of the samples that many of, I would say pretty much all of us have some matching to, the early Neolithic Moroccan sample. Okay, so again, we share some lineage with these ancient Northwest Africans. And you can see this is a sample that goes back 5,000 BC. And so this all ties into what I talked about, all right, with Les Berbers. This was talked about by those anthropologists, but they used linguistics. And I also showed it with the archaeogenetic map, the heat map. I actually used my uncle, but I saw similar patterns with people in and out of tribes. So you can see that this doesn't come as a surprise. This is just consistent. All right. So pretty much anything that I'm showing is repeated in different tests. So it's just all consistent. You can go to the next slide.
And before you go to the next slide, I want to say to the viewer, just give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. For those who are listening and watching, please hit the thumbs up button. It doesn't cost you anything. Okay. It helps, with the algorithm and everything. So if you haven't done so already, please hit the thumbs up button. Please. I know there are more people watching that than the thumbs ups. Okay, so please hit that thumbs up button. Okay. I noticed since we started, the thumbs up hasn't really moved.
Maybe they don't like it.
Yeah, that's you took the words right out of my mouth. What that tells me is they don't like it. Well, um, okay, but all right. So they're doing the thumbs up now. Okay, good, good. All right, you want me to go to the next slide?
Yes, please.
Okay.
All right. Actually, I'm more interested in the bottom portion of that for the listening audience. The bottom portion of that slide. So I wouldn't mind if the top portion. Yeah, I want you to zoom in, and that bottom portion. I don't even mind if the top portion is compromised.
So you want mainly the bottom portion.
Absolutely.
Is that good?
That's good. And if can you zoom?
Zoom in? Okay.
Yes, please.
Zoom in some more.
See, I got to go through this because when I get into the juicy part, then it will make sense. So, but I have to break it down so people could then understand it. All right.
Now,
So
how was that right there?
that's fine. I mean, even though it's
You need me
fine
to zoom in some more?
if you can.
Okay. I think you're doing a phenomenal job, Doc.
Thank you. But we haven't even touched the juicy part. The juicy part's coming, but I have to explain this so they understand.
Oh, yeah, you always have to lay a foundation.
Right. This is my foundation because the juicy part is coming. Okay, so basically, with my true ancestry, one of the things that's very valuable is that when they have an ancient sample, you have the option to look at what would be the closest modern population that's similar to that sample. Okay, so when you look at the ancient Ibermarusians, who would be the predecessors of the Amizigh people of North Africa, the ancient people of North Africa, you can see that in modern times, they are very similar to the Ethiopian at that top. You see it?
Mm-hmm.
And what the audience can't see is that I highlighted, what I did was I clicked on the closest modern. And so the Ethiopian is the closest modern day African, which is similar to the ancient Ibermarusian. Believe it or not, Ethiopians are older than West Africans.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, the West African came from the east, the area of Ethiopia, and that ancient Mota is the father mother of all of them. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we could go to the next slide. So I'm showing the Ibermarusian, the ancient Amizigh is very similar to the Ethiopian. Take note of that. All right. All right. So I spoke about the different components of what genetically comprises the Moors as we know them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the components would be North Africa. Okay. So when we talk about North Africa today, modern times, North Africa is made up of those countries: Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, Sudan. Okay. That's what makes up North Africa. That's a component of the Moors. There's another component of the Moors. Next slide. When we start talking about DNA, you have the North African component and you have the West African component. So when you see these components on your modern DNA studies, it is Moorish. Okay? So that's what we term West Africa. Okay? Next slide. So basically, it's a summary of what I'm saying. The Moorish genetic groups, components: Nigerian DNA, sometimes it's referred to as Yoruba, Isan Yoruba, Benin, Togo, Nigerian East Central, Senegambian, Guinean DNA. Sometimes you see Mandinka, which is used, which is an ethnic group, but you will sometimes see them used as the reference panel. Gambian, Guinean. You have the Ghanaians, uh, also used and categorized with the Sierra Leone. So you have Ghanaian, Sierra Leone. Sometimes you see the Akans used as the reference panel for Ghana, even though you have other groups there. Okay. And then you have the Mende. Then you have the Malian DNA. Sometimes you don't have Malian DNA. And then you have the North African proper. Okay. What we call North African DNA. Now, I have to explain, how is North African DNA different from the above categories? That's also a trick. The difference has to do with modern day geneticists creating a genetic group called North African. That is a modern day construct. If you were to open up a modern day North African, now understand what I'm saying. If you go to North Africa today, you have people who are not any different in phenotype from people from West Africa. Trust and believe that. There are people in Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, who are not any different, in Morocco, Niger, who are not any different phenotypically and genetically from people from Nigeria, Senegal, Gambia. But the question becomes, why are they classified as different? It's a little tricky, and it's done for purposes of separating and pretending. But I have to tell you, a North African is nothing genetically but a mixture of the above components mixed with a certain amount of European and West Asian from the Levant, the area of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. all of that together over time creates a modern North African. So what they are terming North African, I'm talking about geneticists, is based on the miscegenated population, not the dark people that are the what I would call the lesser class, because that a lot of that is still going on, not the people who don't have power or the dark people still living in squalor. Okay, it is based on the mulatto population that's there now who have participated in genetic studies. And a genetic community is simply created through the same people who keep mixing over time, let's say a couple of 100 years, anywhere from 50 to 300 years. That creates a genetic community. So now those genetic communities are called North African. But if you were to look at what's inside of them, you will see Nigerian, Senegambian, Ghanaian, and Malian. You would see those same components mixed with Southern European and West Asian. It is very important for me to emphasize that, because also you will see Horn African, a little bit of Horn African, because that reflects the origin of where they came from. And I will touch upon that shortly. Okay. So that has to be very, very clear. They are not any different. This is why the paintings of the North Africans by the Europeans in general, they were dark. They show them as black skin. When they do black face, they don't show them as the current mulattoes because they are newly created. They show them as dark and black because their predecessors were dark skin, black skin. Okay, so let me emphasize that is a modern construct that totally ignores the darker ones that's there. Okay, so next slide. So we're going to start breaking down these different components. Okay, so this is a sample in Archaeogenetic group, My True Ancestry, and I'm going to show you how they play on words. They use terms like slave, and there was intermixing. Now, the Yoruba DNA, this Yoruba DNA, of all the West Africans, I would tell you they are a little more international than their brethren. They had a presence here in the Americas, not as ancient as the Bantu type of DNA, which was the most ancient. And before that, you had the Pygmy Khoisans. But they set up over here in the area from Mexico to the Caribbean and a little bit of Southeast, because of course we were all mixing and trading with each other. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is it's hard to read, but let me read it. This individual, this is the St. Martin slave. Okay. So this individual was a 25 to 40-year-old buried in the area of Philipsburg, the capital of the Dutch half of the Caribbean island of St. Martin. The individual's teeth had dental modifications. That's key. Dental modification was not done by West Africans. It was done by people in the Americas. You will see dental modification from Cahokia mounds. You will see dental modifications found in skeletons in Mexico. You will see Arawak sites with Negro skeletons. And what did they have? Dental modifications. So it's important to have that understanding so you don't get caught up thinking that just because they found a skeleton with Yoruba type DNA, that this was a slave. This was not a slave.
Say it again, Dr. Fatou.
This was not a slave. This was an individual who had Yoruba type DNA, Yoruba similarity. And they tell you that. Now let's notice the play on words. The first, and now it can't be read, so let me read it to you. The first check mark says Yoruban. And if you go down, then you will then see similarity to Lemba, Bantu, Mandinka, and then you see Yoruba. You notice they use the words Yoruban, not Yoruba. So that's like it's
Mm-hmm.
similar to the
Similar.
Yoruba, similar, but it's not Yoruba. It's not the Yoruba, but
Yoruba.
it's Yoruban like. You see, they're
Mm-hmm.
smart enough to do. They're smart enough to do that, but they gave away the true origins by the filing of the teeth.
Mm-hmm.
It's only in very remote areas, I think it may be in some remote tribe in Central Africa, that files their teeth. This was not a wide practice in West Africa, but this was practiced all throughout Mexico, Cahokia Mounds. You would see skeletons, and especially throughout the Caribbean, Mexico area. So let's move to the next slide. I mean, it can't be seen that well, but let me just tell you what it's about. This is another sample, the 1472 early colonial Mexican city slave trade victim. Again, calling a skeleton with predominantly African DNA, and I say that in quotes. They are referring to that skeleton as a slave trade victim, but in 1472, there was no slave trade. You see that? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Relegating any skeleton with predominant African DNA as a slave. But let's look at the components, the closest components of this skeleton found in 1472. And by the way, those of us that participate, we all have matches to this. Those of us that participate with My True Ancestry, these are one of the top matches that we get. If you look at the top populations, what do you see? Lemba and Bantu. Now that's significant because remember at the very beginning, before I got started, I talked about how we in the Americas have the greatest similarity to Bantu people and how the Bantu DNA makes up 20 to 25% of the Polynesian people.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it is Asian DNA because they got invaded. We
Right, right.
preserve more of our original DNA, but we still have Southeast Asian markers, right? So we actually share that with the oceanic people. They have less of the Bantu. We have more of the Bantu. They have more of the Austronesians who came there, and we have less of the Austronesians. But Tyrone Lewis Cannon already showed, you can Google it, for your listening audience, Tyrone Lewis Cannon, he already proved and showed that 88% of us in his study had Austronesian markers.
Mm-hmm.
But what makes us ancient, it was always linked to that Bantu. So if you look at any kind of DNA, you will see the so-called African DNA that's attached to those Austronesians. It's not West African DNA. It is that Bantu type of DNA because as I've said, and I will repeat, the earliest people all over the planet were the Pygmy, Khoisan, and Bantu people. They were global. Okay, I can't emphasize that. So when you talk about this ancient skeleton in Mexico, they want to attribute this skeleton to slavery, but 1472, there was no slave trade. Columbus didn't even bring him, he didn't even come here yet. And notice the genetic similarity is primarily to the Lemba and the Bantu because those are Bantu. That only represents Bantu similarity. I can't emphasize that enough. Next slide. Again, the naming of all these so-called African dominant DNA individuals as slaves. Again, this is another example. Early colonial slave trade victim in Mexico, Campeche, Yucatan, 1540. Everybody's a slave. You can skip to the next slide.
Okay.
And that's a description of the genetic components of that particular Yucatan skeletal findings. You can see again at the top, Yoruban, not Yoruba. The Yoruba further down. He's what? Similar to the Yoruban. So this Yoruban type DNA was established here. They are not the most ancient of our DNA, but they were established and mixing in. You can
I'm
go to
trying
the
to make
next
that a
slide.
little. Oh, okay. Okay. Why is it not going to the next slide?
So this is an article. If you could bring down the heading so the listening audience can see the title. So if they want to look this up and read it, they can. No, you got it. Determining African birth from skeletal remains, a note on tooth mutilation. So if you read the abstract, let me read the abstract and you'll see what I'm talking about. Tooth mutilation existed in sub-Saharan Africa and was found among slaves transported to the New World, which is interesting because you don't really see it done in West Africa as a large practice. A small number of mutilation cases have been identified in early New World Negro skeletons from the Caribbean and Florida. Okay. We can go to the next slide. And again, I just highlighted what I just said. So I just read it out. So what I did was I enlarged it. So we can move to the next slide. So this is the article talking about file teeth at Cahokia. One of the distinctive characteristics of Cahokia in its area of strong influence is the prevalence of file teeth and many human burials. So you can see this was a pervasive practice here in the Caribbean, North America, Mexico area, which is part of North America. So this was a practice done over here. You do not find it widespread in Africa. It's sporadic. It's not widespread.
Yeah, I have a old book in my archive dealing with that topic, and
Mm-hmm.
it talks about how they did. This is a whole book on ancient American dermatology,
Mm-hmm.
and it talks about the tooth filing. It talks about a lot of the a lot of things that deals with that science um and the teeth and cosmetics and all that kind of stuff right here in the Americas.
Okay.
So you're right on point. You're
Okay.
right on it.
Good. Next slide, please.
You on the next slide? Okay.
All right, so this basically is a reiteration of what I said earlier about the North Africans. This is from a text. So North Africa is a genetically heterogeneous and diverse region and is characterized by diverse ethnic groups, the main ones being Arabs, Berbers, and Copts. North African populations show a complex and heterogeneous genetic structure that has been described as an amalgam of at least 4 different ancestral components from the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and indigenous North Africans. Okay, so I basically said that. All right, that's a modern construct. It's an amalgamated group that was recently created, and the geneticists made it a genetic group. So keep that in mind. Next slide. Okay, so you keep hearing me talk about the Amazigh people, which is the correct term for the people. Some people refer to them as Berbers. That's considered a pejorative. That means barbarian. So a lot of them do not like that term, and they prefer Amazigh. And they are an ancient people of the North African area. However, believe it or not, they are not the most ancient. They are advertised as the most ancient. They are not. And we're going to see that. And that's sort of kept hidden. But if you read and really read and dig, you will see they are still not the most ancient people of North Africa. That's what's promoted. Okay? Next slide.
Okay.
Okay, Mauritania is located in the Western Saharan region of Africa, okay, which also includes Algeria, Mali, and Morocco. Archaeological evidence, oral history, and legends indicate that the Western Sahara supported a flourishing culture during the millennia preceding Christianity. Okay, there is archaeological evidence of copper mining and refining in West Central Mauritania dating back 500 BC to 1000 BC. Now, an early Berber group called the Bafour inhabited the area that is now known as Mauritania. The Bafour engaged in fishing, hunting, and rural livestock herding. The ancestors of 2 modern-day ethnic groups, the Tokolor and the Wolof Black Africans, engaged in valley cultivation. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Why am I talking about the Bafour people? The reason why is the Bafour are a group of people. Their origins most likely ultimately lie in the Mandi peoples, only later to be absorbed by groups such as the Wolof, Serer, Fulani Tuareg. Okay? Bafour has been described as a loose term to encompass the pre-Sanhanja peoples who were part Berber, part Negro, and part Semite. And others describe them as Mandi. Okay? The reason why I'm bringing this up, because you will find that outside of the Nigerian type of DNA, the rest of the West Africans are all various different ethnicities if you trace them back from the Mandi speaking people. And the Bafour people were their antecedents. Why is that important? Because the ancestors of the Amazigh people migrated from the Horn area of Ethiopia around that zone, and they found the Bafour people there, and they dominated them, but they also intermixed with them. This is why Amazigh people today have a great component of that Senegambian, Malian, Nigerian DNA, plus they have some of that Ethiopian DNA, which is a remnant from the area they migrated. And this is important to remember. Number one, there's been this need to make North Africa this mulatto area. So there has been taken away of the Mandi people who predecessors were called the Bafour people, because I guess they're just too black.
Mm.
And the Amizigh people are more related to the Ethiopians. Okay? So there's that prejudice. But there was a merging of those migrants from East Africa who were mixed with the modern day Ethiopian Horn Africans, who are now more mixed with the Eurasians. Because Horn Africans are nothing but Bantu people mixed with a little bit of South Asian, some Romans, and, you know, other Eurasians. And together, that's what gives them that look. A lot of people don't know that. That's from all of those people coming together, creating this horn look. But their basis is still Bantu. Don't ever forget that. It is still Bantu. I don't care if they're discriminatory against the darker Bantu people in their countries, which does exist. That is still their original component. So the Amizigh people came out of those people and migrated into North Africa, where the Bafour people were, who are the antecedents of the West Africans as we know them today, the Malians, the Ghanaians, the Senegambians, and they mixed together, forming the modern day Amizigh people. So I'm giving you a genetic history. So when we look at our DNA test today and we see all of these things, we'll understand where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide. So, who were the descendants of the Mandi speaking people? You find them in various West African countries, which pretty much is West Africa. Benin, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, which is Ivory Coast, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone. West Africa, okay? And there's different groups also called tribes, but ultimately they converge under one people if you trace it back. Okay, next slide. So the thing that's constantly pushed down Caribbean people and so-called African Americans' throats is that our ancestors were taken from West Central Africa, thrown on boats like sardines, and peopled the Caribbean, North America, South America. But again, my focus is the Caribbean, North America. That's what's pushed on us, okay? Well, let's see how true that is, okay? Next slide. So I'm showing the genetic pattern of West Africans. This is someone who is a Yoruba from Nigeria. And as you can see, this tends to be what their genetic pattern looks like, okay? Primarily Nigerian, a little bit of Ghana, Liberian, Sierra Leone. Next slide. And this is somebody who is from Liberia. And you can see this is primarily what they get, because a lot of them come from Mende speaking tribes. So they have that influence. As you can see, Mende and a little bit of Senegambian. So I'm showing you how it appears when they take DNA studies. Next slide. Okay, and this is a Ghanaian. And this is someone from the eastern region, primarily a Kan. And this is what a Ghanaian's result look like. Okay, next slide. Then this is a person from Cameroon. And as you can see, you start getting mixtures from the Angola Congo. You get a little bit of the south border of Nigeria and Bamileke, which is a group found in the Cameroon region. And so they start getting Bantu groups, okay? Because now you've moved into the Bantu areas, okay? So I'm showing this is the people that's there, and this is how their genetic studies appear. Next slide. This is someone from the Congo, and you can see they get matches to where they're from. Okay, because the people from all over this planet have been sampled. So we're not surprised about this. Okay, 100% Congolese. That's what they are. Next slide. And this is someone from Zambia. And you can see they have a lot of similarity to the people of Congo and Angola, even though they're from Zambia. Again, just representing Bantu similarity. Okay, next slide. So this is a lady who is Fulani, and this is her genetic studies, okay? And you can see she gets a lot of Ghanaian, she gets the Senegambian, and she gets that Fulo and Wolof. Take note of that because some of us get that as well. And there's a reason. She gets a little bit of what we call modern North Africa. And it makes sense because she's from Senegal, and that's right near Morocco and Mauritania, where you have those miscegenated populations. So as expected, it would show up on her DNA. Next slide. And this is an Algerian, someone from Algeria. This is someone who identifies as Mozambique. And you will see, it's hard to see there, but the top portion of his DNA shows the Martin mixture. Okay, and you would see that the bottom portion of his DNA, which is like 22%, shows that similar pattern to the Senegalese lady who was a Fulani. And you can see they even tagged him to Fula and Wolof people, but this is not a Fula and Wolof. He's a Mozambique. This is an Algerian who identifies as Mozambique. But look that the DNA caught a portion of his DNA very similar to the Senegambian. So again, and if you look further down, you'll see even Sudanese. Remember I said that the Amazigh people have roots in Northeast Africa. So you will see that Sudanese, Eritrean, Ethiopia, little tiny percentages on their DNA. It reflects their point of origin. That's why they have it, because those two regions are not even geographically near each other. Next slide. Okay, I'm sorry that this quality slide is bad, but perhaps we could zoom in because this is very, very important. I mean, all the slides were important, but now we're moving in. We're getting closer to bringing this close to home, little by little. This is an individual from Tunisia, and he's not too miscegenated as your conventional North African that often participates in these genetic studies. But if you look, you will see at his components, you see that Nigerian. Now, this is Tunisia. Tunisia is practically in the Mediterranean. You can't go further north than Tunisia. He's a full Tunisian. And let's look at his components. You see a little bit of Nigerian, Senegambian. You see some Northeast African, Sudanese. Remember, the Amazigh came from there. And you see a little bit of Ghanaian. Remember I said the North Africans are nothing but the ancient Bafour, who were the fathers and mothers of these people, of the West African. The people they're calling sub-Saharan once inhabited North Africa. It wasn't always a desert. And these people came from East Africa and migrated there and amalgamated and created the modern day North African Amizigh people. And we're looking at the evidence of it. The reason why we can see the truth here is this man is not as mixed as the modern day, what they use as the litmus test of a North African, because what he did was he didn't signal that category of North African as much. So you got to see what was inside of him. And see, and that is the trick. When these other North Africans who are more miscegenated take these tests, it triggers that category of North African. So you get Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. You don't see what's inside of it, and it's not designed for you to see what's inside of it. But see, because he is not miscegenated as those test people who match their test samples, the truth came out with his DNA. And that pattern that he has is the same patterns that came in and intermingled with the indigenous people of the Caribbean and the East Coast, which is why it looks familiar to anybody who's participated with 23andMe. Okay, next slide. Hello?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Can
Okay,
you hear me?
I thought you fell asleep.
No, no, I was muted. I was asking you a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Um,
Go ahead.
but yeah, no, it's not your fault. My mic was muted. You have a question from the chat. Do you want to take it now or later?
Okay, I haven't studied the case of Albert Perry. Actually, Tyrone Lewis Cannon did, and you could Google it. And he actually discovered that this Mbo tribe in Cameroon had absolutely no relation to the A00 of Albert Perry. It was 11 mutational steps different. And that's why it's very important that we have scholars among us who study. They actually discovered it first among Albert Perry, and then they went looking for the match and found it there among a select set of individuals from the Mbo tribe. And it is still not exact.
Exactly.
Okay, so that was not done by me. That was done by Tyrone Lewis Cannon. You can look
Yeah,
it up.
yeah, he sure did. He sure
Next
did.
slide.
Okay.
Okay, this is actually the global distribution of the sickle cell disease haplotypes. So I'm not sure who knows this, but you have different genotypes of the sickle cell. There are different types of sickle cell, and you have the Arab Indian type, the Bantu type, which tends to be in the southern portion of Africa, which is black. You know, they use the color code black. Then you have the Benin type, which is red. And then you have the Senegal type, and then you have one that's called atypical, which is rare. The point of showing this particular map is that I want your audience to understand that West Africans weren't always there. They migrated, okay?
Exactly.
And if you notice, you will see a large collection of that Benin type. Well, we see the Benin type focused around the area of Nigeria, okay, in that region. But if you also notice, you see the Benin type all in the Mediterranean and in the area of the Levant in North Africa. Do you not see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's significant for a reason. Because when I talked about the Moors being the West Africans and the North Africans together made up the people that went into Europe, the Moors, this is an example of the genetic evidence that those people had a wide distribution. They weren't just localized to this area of West Africa. You understand? And we see that demonstrated by the different types of sickle disease, the different haplotypes. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. And this is just another map demonstrating what I'm talking about. It's a little easier to read. So the yellow is the Benin sickle cell type. Then you have the Bantu type that's blue. So as expected, we expect that in the West African areas around Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, that the Benin type would be more dominant. But the Benin type is also the prevalent sickle type found where? In North Africa and in the Arabian Peninsula. And also it would be Southern Europe as well. Okay, so that's important because that has historical implications. So don't think that the people that are in those regions now were always there. That's the point. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a West African. This is a Ghanaian, 100% Ghanaian. And this is the Eurogenes 13. And what I'm showing when I downloaded his data and uploaded it to Eurogenes, again, what I'm showing is that, again, West Africans were not always where they are now. You would see that he has a certain percent of Northeast African, and you can look up, I highlighted it, Red Sea. Red Sea, according to Eurogenes, represents the people around the Northeast Africa, Sudan area, Egypt area, and Saudi Arabia. Okay? So he's a West African, but he has a portion of his DNA that came from there. The smaller portion, the smaller percentages represent ancient. And by the way, even though I didn't highlight it, that Amerindian is there, that's 0.37, okay? So that's just an additional factor I wanted to point out, that even though that represents the Asian-derived natives, they were here a long time. And you can see that mixing, even the West Africans caught that. So many West Africans who participate in genetic studies will get these tiny little bit of Asian DNA markers, and we'll see that as we move on because there was mixing across the Atlantic. Okay. No, Mende people are primarily in the area we now call Liberia, Sierra Leone. That's where the Mende people would be now. I believe even Ivory Coast a little bit. You can go to the next slide. Okay, this is another Ghanaian, and this is the MDLP 22. And again, I'm showing, you can see here, this is an example of what I'm talking about of crossing and mixing. You can see there that South American Amarin, she has 1.48%. That's actually not a small percent. And again, that represents the Asian-derived natives. But again, they have been here long enough, so there was crossing. That's why we, those of us from North America and the Caribbean, that's why there's matching to those sites that I showed earlier in the presentation. And she, even as a West African, a full Ghanaian, she has a little bit of the markers coming from South America. There was trade and mixing going on because we know a lot of the staples in the African continent West Africa included, came from South America. So how did it get there? Through trade: tobacco, cassava, yams, yucca, tomatoes, peanuts, and those are big components of their staple in terms of diet. Next slide. I'm just showing the mixing. Can you enlarge that?
Okay.
That was an error on my side. Right. So basically, I'm showing. Oh, actually, I showed that before. I'm sorry. Go to the next slide. I'm sorry. Okay. So we want to reduce that.
Yeah.
Actually, you can stop there, and then we can move it
I'll,
down.
I'll move. I'll move it down as you go.
Exactly. So basically, this is one of the Ghanaian samples. And in the beginning of the presentation, I showed a heat map, an archaeogenetic map, and I showed the matching to the Mota sample out of Ethiopian highlands. I also showed some matching to ancient Europe. Uh, Again, just confirmation. This is a breakdown using the MDLP 22. So for the Ghanaian sample, one of the samples, you can see that the primary population he's closest to would be the Mandinka and a little Yoruba. Okay, so we're not surprised about that. I said the Mandi speaking people pretty much were the parents of the majority of the West Africans, minus the Yoruba type people, and they became their own different ethnicities, but it all goes back to the Bafour. Let's focus on the second column. I always say, and I will keep saying, that you're not indigenous anywhere if you don't have the primordial populations of the planet. That would be pygmies. So we can see that at the top. Mobutu pygmies. This is just similarity. The pygmies. Then as we slide down, we see STE7. STE7 is an ancient marker of Europe, and it's primarily found in high concentrations among the Sardinians, who are considered an ancient people. So you can see he has evidence of matching ancient people from Europe. And as you move down, what do you see? Bantu. Remember I said the West African is not as ancient as the Bantu. The Bantu is her predecessor. And you can see a little bit of mixing also with South American native, which is based on the Asian derived populations that are there now. So it's evidence of crossing. There was crossing all over the planet, and it was no different with the people of West Africa. But as you can see, the components, the ancient component of the West African comes out of the Pygmies. You have ancient Europe there, and then you have the Bantu. And that was all shown earlier in my presentation. So this is just additional confirmation, because if something is true, it repeats itself in different various ways. Next slide. Okay, so this is the same Ghanaian using the Eurogenes. And so the test population that they use for West African is Yoruba, even though she's not Yoruba, but that's the closest that you're going to get in terms of genetic similarity. So let's focus on the secondary populations, which would be her earlier populations before she became the West African, as we know. Let's look at it. Luia, which is a Bantu people from Kenya. Maasai, a Nilotic people. Somali, that's based on the modern population there now. Ethiopian, based on the modern population now. Moroccan, again, based on the modern population now. And the Mozabite Berber, based on the modern population now. And as you can see, you get Algerian, the Bedouin, which are tribes from the Arabian Peninsula. Then you have PT, that's Portugal, South Italy, Sicily, the Samaritans, which is out of the Levant area near Lebanon or in the area of Lebanon, Serbian, Romanian, Spain, Hungarian. What does this show? This is based on the populations that's there now, but these people still have some genetic similarity there. And Tuscan, which is North Italy. So basically, this is showing the various regions of ancestral migration that is making up the West African. Okay? So West Africans are new to West Africa. You can go to the next slide. This is another Ghanaian. And again, you see the Somali, the Ethiopian, because they came from the East. Their own oral histories tell you they came from the North and East. The North and the East, they all say it. This is the proof. Somali, Ethiopian, Oromo, Tigray, Maasai. Now, when you look with the Pima, the Mayan, because of trades intermixing, okay? Going down. North American Indian, and see, that's carried through us, okay? Because there was trading back and forth. Then you have the Hadza, who are a very ancient Bantu type people, hunter-gatherer Bantu people, Ethiopian, Sudanese, again, just representing a lot of migration, but it represents an ancient part of their lineage before they became West Africans. Next slide. Can you reduce that? Well, you know what? You can slide it up and slide it down, you know. Okay. All right. This is a Lebanese sample, and this is an example of what I'm talking about. So we got to get out of this mindset that West African genetics means that it's directly from West Africa. No, it's not. This is an example of what I'm talking about. This is someone from Lebanon, a full Lebanese. And if you look at what he gets primarily, it reflects where he's from. So we're not surprised about that. Lebanon, okay? Levantine, Northwest Asian, the area of Lebanon. Let's go down because the truth is in the tiny percentages.
Yep.
So we also know the Central Asian. That reflects the Turks coming in because they were occupied under the Ottoman Empire for about 800 years. So that's a reflection of that. And let's go down a little further. Senegambian. and Siberian. Now, we do know that some of the Central Asians carry some Siberian DNA, but what is the Senegambian DNA doing all the way in the area of Lebanon? Remember, I told you that the North Africans, the West Africans, were not always where they were. They migrated. Remember, I just finished showing that the Benin type of sickle cell trait has a big cluster in North Africa, the Levant area in Southern Europe. Now it's making sense. So you can see that his earlier ancestors were very similar to the people out of that West African, Northwest African area. Okay, next slide. So let's break his DNA down using the MDLP 22. Okay, so if we look toward the left of his left part of the slide, which is his primary population, that's what he is now. That's what he's closest to now. So you see Cypriot, which is near Lebanon. It's a little island, Cyprus, in the Mediterranean. And actually, many of the Phoenicians set up colony there, and they actually are the closest genetically to the bones of the Phoenicians, the modern day Lebanese. But that's another discussion. But you can see Jews, Cypriot, Samaritan. Okay, that's what he is now. Okay, let's look at the right side of the column. All right, because this is where we start getting into the meat of it. Okay, so if you look at the right side, you can see the modern day populations of Egyptian, Turks, Yemenis, Libyan. That's based on modern populations. We're not, let's keep going down. African American. What is he doing with 3.6% African American? I should have highlighted it, but you see it under Cypriot. Is right above Puerto Rico. What is he doing with DNA similar to ours? Very simple. The Lebanese people match the bones of the ancient Phoenicians more than anybody on the planet. And they know that they're actually, even though they've been miscegenated, they still have DNA from those Phoenicians who were their direct ancestors. And the Phoenicians were coming back and forth to North America as they were going all over the planet in different areas. And as you can see, he also has Akan markers. The Brong are a people from the Brong Ahafo area of Ghana, which is an Akan subdivision. He also has some Yoruba DNA. He also has some DNA that's found among the Igbo people and the Mandinka people and the Bantu people and the Hausa people. So by no means is this DNA exclusive to those areas. There was migrations going all about. That's what I'm showing by that slide. Next slide. So this is an article talking about Black Londoners through time. And they focus during the period of the Romans. All right. Why is that important? Because remember I talked about the Moors. They were not the first melanated people to come to Europe, but there were two types of Moors, and we just dealt with that. I talked about the West African type, and I talked about the North African type, okay? The Amazigh type. This is where the West African types that lived in Northwest Europe, it traces back to this period. And when I say the West African types, I'm talking about the Nigerian, the Ghanaian, that type, the Benin, Togo, not the modern day Northwest African, not the Senegambian type. This is where the Moors, as we know them, dominated by that DNA, the lower part of West Africa, the Benin, Togo, Nigerian type. This is where they came from, the Roman Empire, and we're going to see that. Next slide. So this is an article talking about Up Down Girl. 10-year-old child buried in Kent in the 7th century was of West African descent. So you can go and read this in detail, but to basically summarize it, she was 33% Isan Yoruba DNA, and she was buried adjacent to two women who were of full Northwest European descent. And it was said that she obtained that DNA from her grandfather, who was 100% Isan Yoruba, and he held a noble position, but they don't provide us with more details. So we know that DNA was there. And he was just not the only one, because if you read other articles, they will talk about how you will see graveyards that they've dug up in areas of Northwest Europe, the area of England, London, and it reflects a multitude of populations, and among them would be what they call sub-Saharan African, West African DNA. So they settled there. That's correct. The smaller percentage indicates the origin, the larger percentage is recent modern ancestry. Or you could say the smaller percentage tends to indicate something that took place in more ancient times. It's not always necessarily the origin. So I wouldn't use the word origin. It may be the origin, or it could just be a reflection of what took place in more ancient times.
Right, right, exactly. I used the wrong word with origin, but yeah, it means ancient. Yeah,
Yeah,
going
it's
back
the more
further.
ancient of your DNA, but it
Right.
doesn't mean it was small. Okay.
Hmm.
All right. So we can go to the next slide. And so that's just expanding on the article. It's just saying how she was buried in typical early 7th century style with a finely made pot knife spoon. She was 67% Northwest European, but she was also 33% West African, Isan Yoruba DNA, and how she was very similar to the people that's currently in southern Nigeria. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. All right, I got this is an article from the Irish Times. If you scroll up, you can see it's from the Irish Times. If anybody wants to go, yep, it's from the Irish Times. Then you can scroll right back down to the highlighted portion. So if you want to read it in details, you know where I got it from. Basically, this is an article from the Irish Times, and they talk about finding Berber and Tuareg heritage, which shows up in Scottish genes, and it's just another support for the abundant Celtic associations found and filmed in North Africa, in song and singers, archaeological monuments, manuscripts, decorations, and jewelry. So basically, When you read the article, they talk about finding DNA from the Tuaregs, who are a type of Berber people, by the way, and among other Berber groups, how there's people from Scotland and Ireland who show tiny genetic markers to those people, but that's not the only DNA they have, but they're just more comfortable talking about the Berbers and the Tuaregs. You know, they like to always associate more. There's always this bias towards North Africa because it's just not too black. That's how they like to see it, because that's what's promoted. But that's something to take note of, because we're going to revisit that. So this is based on the pale population that's there now. And of course, there's some traces of the presence of the Berbers there. That's really all they're really saying. Okay. You can go to the next slide. I'm sorry, someone said Carter G. Woodson. I missed that.
They said Carter G. Woodson was right um, about the where was I? Just lost it. He says go back up. How did I lose that? I was just reading it.
That Carter G. Woodson said that the origin of the Negro was from Spain. Is
Oh
that
yeah,
right?
Spain. Right. Spain and
Portugal?
I don't want to misquote him. Let me
Okay.
see. Um, Spain and North Africa as well.
Was Carter G. Woodson wrong? No, Carter G. Woodson was not wrong, but that's dealing with the people that came in on us. That's the only problem that I have with Carter G. Woodson saying that. If we're going to say that, we need to tell the whole story, because then that would make us foreigners. Of
Right.
course, foreigners came in and intermingled with us. You understand? And I'm just simply teaching our people how to recognize the DNA if we so should participate in the genetic studies. But that's not the origin of the people unless you identify with the people that come in. And I think that's the source of conflict sometimes that happens. But anyway, he was right in terms of a component of the people that came in, yes. But, you know, we can go to the next slide. I think you have it up. Can we expand on that?
Sure.
We're getting there now. We're getting to the juicy part.
Now we're gonna have to wrap it up in 5 minutes.
Okay.
We're
So
34. We're 35 minutes over. Um, so in 5 minutes we'll wrap up, and then we'll have a Q&A
all
um,
righty.
for
Right.
about another 5 or 10, about another
Okay.
10 minutes. We'll have a
No,
Q&A.
no problem. I'll just come back and we'll finish it up. So
Yeah,
basically,
yeah, we can do it like that. Oh, I zoom out, right?
yeah, you want to zoom out. So basically, where I'm going, which will be a nice segue into the next time I come in, and you kind of move it over. I
And
will just tell you.
it won't do any. It won't. Your slide.
No, okay, this is what I want you to do. Let me explain. This is someone from Sicily. This is a Sicilian person. This is what I'm showing briefly. This is a Sicilian individual. So the next series of slides that I'm showing is that this West African DNA, right? You will see it all over Europe. Okay? So if you don't understand this, you have to think broad. That's why I'm showing all of this. These guys were not, this DNA is not exclusive to West Africa, but if you don't understand what the genetic patterns look like in other groups, you get trapped into thinking, well, if I have it, that means it's because my ancestors come from West Africa. All right. So this is a Sicilian. And if you zoom in, you can focus in on that bottom right there. You'll see, what do you see? Ghanaian, Liberia, and Sierra Leone DNA. You understand? This person is from Sicily. That's what I'm showing. You see it? And of course, you have the Martin, North African, Levantine mixture. See, we expect that. But that tiny West African, what is it doing there? Remember, I showed how the Ghanaians in the samples, how they were getting Southern Europe and Sicily in the Jed match in their secondary populations in old Europe. Look, this is a Sicilian. So that DNA, we have to think it's not just in West Africa. So when I say that the Moors are the West Africans and the North Africans genetically, I'm showing you. Okay, next slide. You can skip that. I'm just reiterating the same thing. Next slide. Okay. Actually, go back to that other slide, because that was another example of what I'm talking about. Okay, this is someone from Portugal. Okay, what do you see? The primary DNA represents and reflects the population that's there now. So we're not surprised about that. Let's look at the tiny percentages. Let's go down.
Okay.
We're not surprised about West Africa, North Africa, which is based on the modern populations there now. Oh, what do you got there? Nigerian. What is he doing with Nigerian? Even though it's tiny, what is he doing with it? Okay, next slide. Let's slide up. This is someone from England, someone who's from Great Britain. And of course, that's reflected in the majority of their DNA, which is based on the population that's there now. But let's slide down.
Okay.
This is someone from England, not someone from here, by the way, where you can argue, oh, they had some transatlantic Africa. No, what do you see? Broadly West African, 1.4%.
Got him.
Next slide, if my 5 minutes is not up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
That's okay. So basically, where
Now,
I'm moving off is I'm showing how there are vestiges in the modern European of these Moors. That's what I'm showing. And we'll pick up when I come back.
yeah. So what I would like to do is to um, allow for a few of the people from the audience who would like to join the panel. We have about 10 minutes, and if they want to ask questions, you know, leave your email in the chat, and I'll send you the link, and we'll get you on. Okay, that's if you're interested. So give it a couple of seconds, and I'll allow you to wrap up your while we're waiting for them to leave their email in the chat. I'll allow you to wrap up your discussion for this discussion, and then we'll pick up on it on the part two
Okay.
at on another date.
So wrap up. I can wrap up now while
Yeah.
they're. So basically, I'm showing the genetic components and how it shows up of the Moors, of how we know the Moors to be the North Africans, the West Africans, their genetic groups, how it presents itself in the people of West Africa, North Africa, how it appears on genetic tests. I gave the evidence of the migration. I showed evidence of their presence in areas that are outside of their territories today, out of modern day West Africa and North Africa. We saw it with the Lebanese sample. I showed evidence of the tiny vestiges of the remnants of that mixing in modern day Europeans. Uh, and those areas are nowhere geographically near West Africa. I showed the historical documentation with the presence of Up Down Girl and the presence of the lower West African, lower being the Benin, Togo, Nigerian area, how they settled in Northwest Europe and how they were a different type of genetic group from the Northwest African, which is more Senegambian types. So basically, they came into Northwest Europe from the Roman Empire. Okay. And I'm just showing evidence of all of these people, whether they're the Northwest type of uh, African, which is dominated by the Senegambian, Malian types, or whether it's the lower type of West African, which is dominated by the Benin, Nigeria, Ghanaian types. Both types have been present in tiny percentages from the Levant to different Europeans. And that's what I'm showing.
Mm-hmm.
Usually 1% of Sardinia, and if you recall in an earlier slide, I showed you that DNA consultants did studies on their Pima natives, and also you would see many of us as so-called African Americans, or whether we belong to any of the East Coast tribes, we all tend to have some matching to the Sardinia people and to Southwest Europe, and some of it reflects ancient mixing. I showed that with some of the genetic studies. So I would say that Sardinia very well may represent some sort of ancient lineage, uh, and people from the North American tribes tend to the North American people called now African American, or whether they are tribal members or not, we tend to get these matches to Sardinia and the Mediterranean. And of course, there's the added factor of the fact that these areas were cleaned out of their Moorish population and served as so-called African slaves as a source, which I will get into when I come back.
Nice, 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 nice. And again, for those who desire to come and chat with Dr. Fatou Diarra, leave your email in the chat and I'll send you a link. And we'll give you another 3 minutes to do that. If not, then we'll just close out the show. We're getting a lot of um, feedback in the chat, but I'm going crazy trying to keep up with these comments and stuff. The best thing to do would be to just, um, leave your email and, let me send you a link and, just come on and chat with the doc for a few minutes. It's hard for me to even keep up with all of these comments.
It would be
from
better, wouldn't it be better for these DNA companies to use real historians to name these haplogroups? But you know what? I'm going to be very honest. I don't think any of these results and these DNA tests were done with our interest in mind. Now, I do understand why a lot of our people tend to run from it and just throw it away. I do understand that because if you don't really understand it, you can get caught up in a trap of looking upon your DNA as you're a foreigner. But what I'm saying is that if you do intend to use it, then I'm explaining it.
hmm
Why did the Moors separate themselves? Because if you go back, you will see that there was a separation based on religion. You will find that the Muslims did not see the Muslims and the Christian the Christian population of the Iberian Peninsula did not have a sense of brotherhood. What they would call the infidel or the animist population of the African population. We don't that still exists. They might be the same or similar or look similar, but they did not consider themselves the same as the population that were animists, that were not Islamic or Christian or Jewish, because many of the Sephardic Jews were just straight up black. I'll get into that later, and I have the documented proof of that as well. But that's later on when I come back. Yeah, we do have more lineage, and I will show that because I'm working myself up to it. I just have to first give the audience a background to understand how pervasive this West African DNA was and how it's not how it's not exclusive to West Africa. You first have to see it to understand then, and I'll work itself to how it relates to us.
and what this says based on your findings is that the Prophet Noble Drew Ali was right on point.
Yes, he was.
He was way ahead of his time, and he didn't have the luxury of DNA that we have now. For that science not to exist back then, it's very commendable for what he was able to bring to us.
Absolutely. Actually, the reason why I believe him is because I look at the DNA studies and the DNA supports what he's talking about. You understand?
hmm
And these were the people that came in on us
Yeah, exactly.
from pre Columbian to modern times as indentured servants. And I'll go into all of that later when I come back.
Okay, so let's see. I'm gonna wrap it up now. Um, we're almost an hour over time, and nobody has desired to join the panel. So I'll close the show out now. And I definitely thank you, Dr. Fatou Diarra, for joining us. You know,
It's always good to be on the show.
yeah, yeah. It's always good to have you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. And I know you have a lot more to share.
I have a
You
lot more. We're winding down, so it won't be as exhaustive as it is, and we'll be able to finish in time. We've done the nitty gritty.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sacred Grove says top notch info.
Thank you.
Yeah. We have a vast, he also says we have a vast, vast, vast history. That's very correct.
That's very true.
We surely do. And what it's about is putting all of the pieces of the puzzle together, you know,
Absolutely.
and not allowing our feelings to get in the way or try to push any narratives, but to look at the evidence and weigh in on that evidence, regardless of what that evidence is.
Well,
You know?
that's the key to doing very good research. You can't be attached to the outcome. If you are attached to the outcome, and you
Yep.
want to dismiss things that you don't like because you have visceral reactions to it, you can't be a good researcher. You have to be a true.
Hmm.
You have to be a truth seeker, fierce truth seeker, right?
Yeah. That's the name I was given. But that's my whole philosophy is, when doing research is I'm not, whatever the outcome is, I'm okay with it.
That's right.
We just want to get down to the truth.
Absolutely.
Hmm. And Awanasa says someone called her Geechee because her nana was from South Carolina.
Well, they were really more the coastal areas. The interior areas weren't necessarily them.
Okay, so yeah, Doc, we'll pick it up on the next show, and I thank everyone who had joined in, and again, for those who are generous enough to leave a donation. um, I'll leave the information in the chat. Um, it's right here. Give me 1 second. Yeah, this was a powerful show. I mean, you really did your thing. And I know also, I don't know if your audience, if you um, express to your audience that you will be coming out with a book at some point in the near future. Did you?
No,
But
I didn't tell anybody that, but that's definitely on the near agenda because I want our people to understand this. I don't want us running from. I'm not encouraging anybody to do DNA, but I think if you understand it along with genealogy together, the two of them make for a powerful tool. Um,
I agree 1,000%. 1,000%. I mean, it's helped me tremendously.
Me too.
Genealogically, it's helped me tremendously. It's allowed
Absolutely.
me to jump uh, light years ahead from where I was. And I had a strong foundation with genealogy, but doing the DNA, it has really catapulted my genealogy light years.
Me too. Absolutely. I
Because what it allowed me to do with a lot of the matches that I came across, some of the relatives that I found, certain oral histories that they had that I didn't have, and certain ancestors name surnames that I didn't have, they had. So it really, oh man,
oh yeah.
I can't agree with you more.
Oh yeah. The oral history and even the ancient history. I know my dad is from Ghana, as you know, and he
Hmm.
always said his people migrated from the east and the north. Some of
Mm,
the Ghanaian elders say that they migrated from Ethiopia and some of their ancestors came from the north.
mm.
So the DNA and the archaeogenetics support that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, Ethiopia is very ancient anyway. When
Exactly.
you study the history, it's
Right.
one of the oldest places in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've done a lot of research on ancient Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating
Oh
to
yeah.
say the least. But yeah. So anyway, I'll look forward to having you back very soon.
Oh yeah.
We'll get together and discuss a date, and I'll give ample notice to the audience
Oh
when that'll
definitely.
be.
I
Mm,
would like to I hope that we can have a mutual time where I can come back soon because it's still fresh in the
mm-hmm.
audience mind. So
Okay.
I don't have to do too much recap, reviewing before I move
Mm-hmm.
ahead. And because
Okay.
it's still fresh, it'll I think they will have a great appreciation as I move on.
Now, are you relegated to Saturday, Sunday? Um,
I'm free on Thursdays.
on Thursdays. Okay, maybe we can do something for Thursday.
But that's
Let's.
July. I don't mind doing it July the
Oh
4th.
wait a minute. This Thursday is the 4th, right? Yeah, we may have a low turnout because of the fact that this Thursday is the 4th, but maybe not.
I'm
Yeah.
free.
What do y'all say in the audience? Can I get a poll before we log off? Can I get consensus from what do y'all think about uh Thursday?
I could do it Friday too, July the 5th.
July the 5th. Okay. We can do that too. Okay, one person said okay. Um
I think July the 5th. These people are going to be barbecuing. I don't
yeah,
trust them.
yeah, yeah. I don't trust them either.
Mm, I
That's
know.
why
I know how they get down.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's why you hear some hesitation in my
Yeah.
voice. So let's say maybe the following week because I know particularly here in New York,
Mm-hmm.
this 4th of July weekend, you know, it's a lot going on, and then you got the African Street Festival going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot going on, you
No
know.
problem.
Yeah. So, and I'll be out of town. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, but I'll have downtime. So, I'll be
Okay.
chilling.
Don't worry. We will do something real soon, even if it's the following week.
Yeah, but I mean, this week is a good week because I'll be chilling. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I know again that it's in terms of for the audience, it's going to be a lot going on. So
Right.
this would probably be a bad week.
Right.
Like you say, I don't trust them.
Yeah, I know. I don't trust. I
I
know
know how to get down.
exactly.
Yeah, but yeah. So to be continued,
All right.
and thank you very much.
Okay. You're welcome.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So I'm gonna close out the show now,
Okay.
and I'll put you backstage. And yeah, so I thank you all for joining in. Okay. And again, for those who are generous enough, I left the information to leave a donation if you're moved to do so. Um, it's right here um, in the chat and on the screen. Okay. So it would be greatly appreciated. All right. And on that note, I'm going to sign out. Okay. Saying, do da da, gahan e, sadame, ayo.